Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui in Hainan at the Boao Forum for Asia. The theme this year focuses on new visions and new dynamics for the future of Asia, and I'm happy to be joined by the former Prime Minister of New Zealand, Dame Jenny Shipley. Since leaving office, Dame Jenny has been involved in developing relations between China and New Zealand. She sits on the boards of the New Zealand-China Council, the Boao Forum, and the China Construction Bank New Zealand. She is taking part here in discussions on inclusive finance and on the 21st century maritime Silk Road. But before we begin, let's take a look at this.
China and New Zealand have enjoyed good long-term relations since the two countries established diplomatic ties in 1972. New Zealand is not only the first Western country to support China's entry into the World Trade Organization, but also the first developed country to establish a free trade area with China in 2008. Chinese President Xi Jinping visited New Zealand in 2014, taking bilateral ties to a new height. New Zealand is seeking new opportunities by embracing China's blueprint for the 21st century maritime Silk Road and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Benefiting from the FTA, China is now both the top export destination for goods and the top source of imports from New Zealand, with total trade amounting to over 18 billion New Zealand dollars in 2015. Although the volume of milk powder exported to China fell in 2015, it was still the largest commodity, while smaller exports such as beef and fruit doubled in value in the past year.
And we recognise the importance of China as a nation that trades so freely with us. So I can tell you that our two-way trade has now doubled, but in fact what we are sending to China has quadrupled. The work we do together has moved on a lot since this was signed in 2008 and is extremely valuable to us. We value it very highly.
The FTA has also built a bridge for China to learn from New Zealand's advanced techniques and management experience. Following the development of communication and cooperation mechanisms, China is expected to introduce New Zealand's food safety supervision system to improve its own food safety. People-to-people exchanges between the two countries are also increasing. In 2014, more than 30,000 Chinese students studied in New Zealand, an increase of 18% over the previous year. They make up 27% of the country's international student population. Visitors from China have risen by 34% in 2015 to reach 350,000. And the profile of Chinese tourists is changing rapidly. They're staying longer and spending more. Chinese tourists now contribute more than $1 billion to the economy, which helps make tourism New Zealand's biggest export earner.
Welcome to Dialogue. Thank you. You came to China a dozen or so times after you left the office, and it seems China is a wonderful place for you. Tell me why you still maintain such strong interest in this dynamic country, which is declining somehow to the dismay of observers of Asia and the future of this region.
Look, I've been privileged to watch China closely, and since I left office I've been here actually more than 70 times. So
That's amazing, absolutely amazing.
Well, I have been lucky to have the chance in many roles, as a former Prime Minister, as a Director of CCTV Global, to speak in many provinces, and it has been my privilege to have a lens on this development. I'm optimistic, not pessimistic, because there are a few economies that have come from, $3 trillion to $11 trillion in size in such a short time. And while the economy is going through a transition, actually it's the same as all maturing economies, where you can't rely on investment in infrastructure for permanent growth. You must come into a sustainable growth period, and that's what I see happening in China today.
As what we do is try to de-stock the overcapacity, and dairy is a key part of your economy. What would you do to reorient the relationship between the two economies?
Well, look, we are very small as an economy in New Zealand, and China very large and important. We very much pride ourselves in the free trade agreement that was achieved between our two economies. Dairying is a critical part of that, and a number of other industries are as well. So we never rely on one thing. We rely on many parts of the relationship with China. to succeed. And while dairying at the moment has come down slightly, for example, tourism is rising significantly. And New Zealand doesn't ever think about only one aspect, but rather the long-term sustainable part of that relationship. And most of our aspects, with the exception of dairying and our two-way trade with China, is growing presently. So we are not pessimistic.
You are the first developed country to let China in the WTO, and we are very grateful. What were your thoughts?
Look, we live in a small world, and I think in New Zealand, because we export so much of what we produce, we're a small country, but we produce far, far more than we need in many, many areas. Timber, dairying, meat and wool, kiwi fruit, wines, many aspects. So we need to have good rules so that the people with whom we are trading have a clear understanding. And New Zealand took the view, as we saw a rapidly emerging China, that having China in the rules-based system rather than outside it would be good for China, because it builds confidence in the investment community, it builds confidence in the two-way trade relationships worldwide, but it also gives people a certainty that if things go wrong, you've got an honest broker in the WTO to help the countries through that. And so we felt very strongly that we should support China's accession to the WTO. So it was a very obvious thing to do.
I'm also surprised, sweetly, that Australia also acts likewise the way you did in encouraging a dialogue between the United States and China, the two biggest economies in the world. But I'm also surprised, not in a very good way, that there is a big perception gap between you and your big ally, the United States, in examining the new realities in China. The United States, President Obama said in the second presidential debate for the second term that China will be their adversary unless China complies with the rules in the rule-based world. And yet, as far back as in the late 1990s, you already encouraged China to join the WTO, as if China was doing very well in complying with the international norms in many ways. Why there are such big differences?
Well, look, in trade, let's focus on the WTO. Every economy that joins the WTO has to look at itself, and if it's already compliant, it can join easily. If it is not there yet, it has to agree on certain things it will do, but it's got a solid framework. I don't want to comment on the foreign policies of major economies, other than to say New Zealand looks for a harmonious world. We, of course, understand that there will be differences of preference, differences of emphasis, but we tend to try and promote finding the common ground rather than focusing on the differences. And while we have been a strong ally of the United States and others over many years in key strategic issues, we are also a strong ally of China. And we don't, in promoting, free trade and joining the AIIB, New Zealand was first in the developed economies to sign up to that idea, not because we simply were pro-China, but we thought China's idea of having another vehicle to promote economic development in East and Central Asia and South Asia is critical to the future of the world. So we don't pick favourites on economic development, we think for ourselves.
I often find myself repeating much the same question when I do interview with either Aussies or people from New Zealand. The question is, politically you belong to the Western world, but culturally and economically you are very much integrated with the rest of Asia. And also some people in your country, and perhaps it's a consensus, that your future lies in Asia. Why do you say so?
Look, our future lies in the balance. We still do enormous amounts of trade with the United Kingdom and Europe, the United States, Australia, of course. New Zealand and Australia are very significant trading partners. Our economies are all but integrated. But the emerging middle-class demand from China is offering new opportunity to most economies who are committed to working out how to engage. New Zealand has also had many waves of migration. And we are a young country that is very much more open than closed. And I think that migration effect means that even though we are aligned in one area of freedom and foreign policy and our values around democracy, which matter to New Zealanders. We are also open-minded and respectful of other systems. And if we have something to say, we say it privately and appropriately. We still express our opinions, but we work and collaborate with people who are trying to make progress because we see it in our interest. But we also want to share what we have learnt in reform, in development, in conciliation and collaboration, because we think these matter in an increasingly integrated world.
Increasingly, many young Chinese students go to your country to pursue academic studies, and they have learned a lot about the charm of New Zealand. Having said this, what do you expect them to come back with?
Look, we are delighted. We enjoy having your young people here. My children and my grandchildren have learnt a lot from that opportunity to collaborate with young people from China. By the way, both of my children, who are now in their late 30s, have lived in China because I wanted them and they wanted to learn how people in China thought and did business and so on. So this generation coming is much more open to possibilities. What do we think they've learned when they come back? I hope they've learned that even though China is on a journey of reform, from rapid growth to sustainable growth, that small economies like New Zealand have also been through that change of opening up, of allowing markets to function properly so that human and financial resources go to the right places across the economy. We changed our state-owned enterprises in the 80s and 90s, and now it's matured into very good dispersed businesses. I'm sure that they will learn something about New Zealand's reform, something about business, and I hope something about the friendliness and openness of New Zealand society. I also hope they'll enjoy being there. We have very many environmental advantages, and I know many of your tourists who come just love the chance to see and do things. And
I'm confident many of my nationals have developed a deep sense of humility, ready to learn from New Zealand, which is small in size, but which is very honest and has developed very good experiences in the way of governance in shaping their own sound future that we are ready to share with you, your nation.
Well, look, as I watch China now, in many respects, the current president is driving to see that the rules and the rule of law that allow business to flourish are well developed and then well understood, so you can unleash the potential. People often mistake the fact that rules are required to control. Rules allow us all to understand the space within great new business can be done. And I watch the transition in China with great interest, and I remain optimistic.
Let me follow up one of your points here. You came here at least a dozen or so times each year after leaving office, and you said, quote, the more you came, the more you realized that there's always something behind the wall in China. What do you mean by behind the wall?
One of the things I learnt in both watching businesses and then being involved in business is you can't assume everyone thinks the same. So we all come to the same problem with different experiences, different life experiences, different cultural experiences, different systems. And so you have to be open to what you don't know. So you bring what you know to the deal, but it's what you don't know that often disappoints people in the future. So what I mean by that is when people in New Zealand and people in China are doing business together, they need to pause and see that their understanding of what they're seeing and hearing and our Chinese counterparts, there is a meeting of minds, and it takes time. It takes time to understand the cultural nuances of language and backgrounds, but it also takes a lot of listening to see what each of the companies are looking as an outcome. The best deals that I've seen done between China and New Zealand and China are the ones that have spent enough time really understanding what is in the mind of the investor, what both hope to achieve, so it is a win-win. And if you don't take enough time, if you rush into this, often then you have to come back and untangle things or try and explain. So understanding what you don't know, rather than assuming that everyone's experience is the same, is a lesson I learned early, And it's a cautionary opportunity, not a risk. It's an opportunity that if you make the right time available, you'll get it right.
15 years after China entered into the WTO, we still find ourselves on the way of the new long march, and I'm afraid your years of experiences with the PRC is also a journey of discovery and rediscovery. Let's share some of your thoughts about what the future might hold for a country which is labeled now a middle-income economy.
Look, it's not my job to comment on how China and the people of China choose to be governed. Let me share some observations, though. Governments of every hue are successful as long as they meet their people's expectations.
We have lifted up to 600 to 700 million people out of poverty.
And that is a huge achievement. Even the most significant critics of China cannot dismiss that. It is an outstanding achievement. China led in achieving the Millennium Goals of specifically focusing on people who needed to be lifted. And I see that continually developing. Your leadership has been extremely committed to that, but through their design, up until now, they have been able to make that transition enormously successful.
But we are humbled by the fact that there are still 70 million living under the poverty line in China.
I understand that, and many economies still are extremely anxious about leaving groups behind, because in any society, a democratic society, any type of political framework, if you leave people behind, you create disappointment and therefore risk. So China, like New Zealand and like Australia and like the United States, has to have regard for the people who feel excluded. And the only way you can solve that is through good economic leadership, through social inclusion, through financial inclusion, finding ways where the finance system is accessible to everyone, not just to those with assets. And some of the program at BOA this year is focusing on inclusive finance. In other words, how do we make sure we're not just serving those who are already well served, but rather find ways to allow the people who don't have bank accounts. By the way, innovation will allow big change here. I think the platforms where people know you better through data and through communication and through your habits may well allow the human connection rather than the asset connection to allow credit to be advanced. And China is so much a leading player in e-commerce that I think we will see some of the world innovations in this space as well, where people who haven't had the classical framework of a house or a property or something, we may well see the leading position of e-commerce in China allow to e-finance and inclusive finance be a breakthrough. I personally, from what I see, not only in the big institutions, but some of the innovation I have observed here, I think you're at the leading edge, not behind.
You know, Dame Jenny, I'm already a fan of your leadership. And thank you very much for the very warm and promising as well as balanced comments on China and our relationship with New Zealand, a friendly country in the Asia-Pacific region. You are watching Dialogue with Madam Dame Jenny Shipley, former Prime Minister of New Zealand. We've been talking about, you know, as I said earlier, relationship between China, New Zealand, and where we can learn from each other. Please stay with us. We'll be back in a short while. Welcome back. As we are here to talk about the new innovation and new dynamics in the new future of Asia, the theme of this BOA Forum for Asia, I'd like to have your comments on what might be the most important hallmarks of a female entrepreneurship? Because we are talking about what will be the driving force for the next stage of Chinese economic development as we face the brutal downward pressure of the slowdown. Now, males and females share much the same in the age of, in the 21st century. Can we learn anything from New Zealand, where you have got two female prime ministers?
Look, entrepreneurship in New Zealand, it's a small economy that grew very quickly, and over 100 years it's been able to still enjoy above average growth. Even now, for a fully developed economy, we're growing at about 3%, where a lot of our similar economies worldwide are struggling. But to answer your question around entrepreneurship, inclusion leads to entrepreneurship. And particularly when you deregulate an economy, you then need to see that the middle part of the economy flourishes. So your SOEs, the big guys, are still here and they're important. Although there are often many businesses in those organisations that if they're split up and reallocated with new governance and new management structures, the overall contribution to the economy is greater than when they stay in a single unit. Certainly that was our experience in New Zealand. When we broke up the conglomerates and dispersed them again across a broader group of the economy, the actual output collectively was greater than the single entity. Women, when they are in these roles, and the government often appoints women as directors of the government's companies and also the listed companies, because along with their male colleagues, they have found that they do bring EQ and IQ and CQ. What I mean by that is they clearly bring their intelligence, where they're well educated, but they bring their emotional intelligence, their insights, their human insights and instincts, and when you bring those together, it makes a difference. When you're doing business with China, you also need cultural intelligence. In other words, how do we work together? And even in my bank that I chair for CCB, the New Zealand subsidiary, I've got New Zealand experienced and qualified people, young Chinese students who are fluent Mandarin and New Zealand speakers, and then people from Beijing. And my job is to see that this leading management team and our board, and we have a mix on the board as well, that we bring our intellect but also our insight to the purpose of growing this subsidiary. And it's not straightforward, but when you make the right effort, you get very rapid growth. So bringing the right people to the table, including men and women, is very important.
And take a right side of history. That's very important for whatever leadership manifested in the West or in the East. Now, media comments, particularly tabloid, may not be very polite with the women leadership. For example, Hillary Clinton, who's running for presidency in this election year in the United States. And now, we've heard a lot of beautiful stories like the success story of Mother Teresa, Indira Gandhi, late Prime Minister of India, and you as yet another example in a small country like New Zealand. Hillary Clinton, many say, well, she benefits from the glow of her husband's image and experiences in politics. Therefore, people vote for Donald Trump because they are getting tired of professional politicians and they want to see a new face to express their new anger and fears. What do you think of, say, the uphill battles for Hillary and like-minded career politicians in the West?
Look, it's very difficult in many economies still for women to be elected, but over time there are more and more who have succeeded. We've got Angela Merkel in Germany. We've had Margaret Thatcher, of course, long before I was in politics. We've now had Australian and New Zealand prime ministers. We're seeing some women prime ministers in Southeast Asia. It takes time for people to get used to women in roles that they have been almost unconsciously biased to expect men in. In my own experience, we've still got a long way to go here before it will be natural and comfortable for us to see women and men as potential prime ministers or governors or vice governors or so on. But that change happens over time. And I would simply put, whether it's in China or the United States, you know, why wouldn't you choose to have the experience of a woman leader? I'm often asked abroad, you know, do I think a country is ready for a woman leader? I mean, why would you deny yourself half of the potential that exists in any country? In my experience, I've met Hillary Clinton and I know President Clinton, former President Clinton well. It would be a mistake to say these are part of the same. I mean, these are very intelligent people who are extremely experienced in their own right. And in the end, the American people will judge, depending on who the Republican candidate and who the Democrat candidate will be. And I don't think that's clear yet.
I'm not going to talk more about the blame game between males and females. However, don't you think women in whatever countries would be criticized? They are part of the problem instead of the solution when it comes to an election for women leadership. They themselves are humble and they are not very confident to assume leadership and to look tough. Do you think this is a chronic problem for female voters?
Look, I think women are often socialized into being in support, not in the lead.
sorry for saying so, but some of the women prefer to be on the tea stage and do catwalk to enjoy the center stage and the sunshine on,
I think that's partly true. But look, remember...
Is that gender discrimination?
I think you are assuming that the same bias that has already existed will forever continue. But as I have watched China in the last decade, it has become more and more open. Even in the young people I meet and work with in the many businesses and roles that I've had. So I see the emancipation of China, and in doing so the emancipation of both women in different roles and
from kitchens and their traditional roles.
Even when I went into politics, I remember a rather elderly gentleman saying, who was minding my children? So that was one question. And why wasn't I at home, doing my manual tasks? And that wasn't my problem. Actually, it was his problem, because as a generation, he still did not see the potential. I would want to say to everyone in a country like China, you are going to be immensely influential in the future. Why wouldn't you embrace the broad capability of your population in its full sense? And while I know there have been social roles, women don't take 7 days a week to care for their family properly, because technology allows them to do many things. And so we shouldn't pretend that we haven't all advanced. Men can also help care for their families in different ways, and shared responsibility for families allows a shared economic future for the economy and its people. And that it's not a demand, it's an opportunity. Why wouldn't you do it?
Were Hillary Clinton voted into office of the White House, and will you be able to take side with her on one of the occasions? And she said in the private conversation, supposedly asking for your advice about how to deal with China, potentially the biggest competitor against the United States. What would you say to her?
Well, look, I would always say engage, meaningfully engage. You mentioned politics earlier. You should always not confuse the noise of politics, whether it's China voice or United States voice, and the pragmatism of leaders when they are then trying to solve problems. And I'm not saying that people are dishonest, but they have to give confidence to their people, but they also generally, in my experience, are committed to trying to find a way through. So my advice to all leaders, not just West or East, would be to think about meaning and full engagements, to explain your intentions and explain the way in which you intend to engage, particularly in areas where you might have had historic presence, but not a dominant or a visible presence, because that's actually the issue that's changing in the South China Sea. China's ability to deploy its strategic intentions is quite different than 15 or 20 years ago. And I think that constant explanation of why these things are important are the ways forward.
I hope New Zealand will not be caught in the crossfire between the two biggest economies. You would instead be an honest broker.
And we would normally do that. We don't wish to get involved in the detail. We want to trade well with you, share cultural experiences with you, invite you to our country and have New Zealanders come to China so that we understand each other properly. That is the best type of diplomacy from a New Zealand point of view.
All right, thank you very much. I do appreciate it. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.